Hey everyone, welcome to the video. If you're new to the channel, my name is Solomon Thomas. I'm a former Marine Corps officer and I just got my master's in general psychology. I have the goal of becoming a clinical psychologist and professor one day, so I'm making these YouTube videos to practice articulating myself and clarifying my thoughts on these various ideas that I'm wrestling with. And I also hope that some of these ideas might be useful or interesting to anyone out there who's listening. So in this video, I want to talk about how not to critically think, or how not to properly wrestle with ideas, in my opinion. As I mentioned, I just got a master's in general psychology, and many of the patterns of uncritical thinking that I'm going to try to elucidate in this video come from my various experiences in that program. The three patterns that I wanted to talk about were whenever I would present an idea, or many times when I present an idea that's perhaps unorthodox, or maybe it's not mainstream, maybe it's a newer idea, or maybe it's an older idea that people just haven't thought about in a long time, I would get a few different responses. So one response would be, oh, that's from a pop book. So I would mention something, let's say by Jordan Peterson, for example, and many of Jordan Peterson's books have sold millions of copies. And so from the perspective of many of these academics, whether they be professors or even my colleagues, they would say something like, oh, I don't really need to listen to that or engage in that idea because that's for like the lay people. That's a mainstream idea. That's popular science that hasn't been vetted by peer review or rigorous academic scrutiny. At least that would be the idea. And so that never sat well with me because it completely bypassed the argument or the idea or the claim that I was trying to put forth. And I'm not even trying to put forth these ideas as if they're absolutely correct, but it's just, I would notice that would be one technique for ignoring an idea without having to wrestle with it directly. Another example, I would talk about Jonathan Haidt's books, one of them being The Coddling of the American Mind. And I had a professor just say straight up, like, oh, that's a pop book. It's like, there are many statistics and interpretations of those statistics and peer-reviewed articles that are cited in that book. So which part of it is exactly popular? Is it the case that if an idea is put in a book and that book sells in a very popular way, that all of a sudden that idea is no longer valid or it's not scientific? So that was just something that I didn't like. And to try to be charitable, I can understand the heuristic of only wanting to read articles that are peer reviewed or articles that have been replicated, or maybe they've been published in the most exclusive high-end journals. I can understand that to a degree, and that's something I'm going to talk more about at the end of the video after I get through these three patterns. Like, there's so much information in the world, and so we do need shortcuts and criteria to help us filter out what we need to attend to and what we're not going to attend to. Otherwise, we as we're investigating and trying to develop our knowledge in a domain, we'll have to read everything, and I don't think anyone's going to do that. So that's one technique or heuristic that I'm not particularly fond of, although I can understand that, yes, maybe there are popular books and popular self-help books. Again, I'm really speaking about this in the context of psychology, that aren't necessarily the most rigorous. Maybe some people would say that James Clear's book Atomic Habits is a pop book. It's like, I've read that book like 2 or 3 times. I think it's great. I think there's valuable information in it. And anyway, so that's one technique that I heard that I didn't enjoy, and I didn't feel like the person I was engaging with was speaking from a place of good faith and open-mindedness and actually trying to learn. They would just cast aside the book or the ideas that I was talking about as like pop or mainstream. The second pattern that I want to talk about is, again, I would present someone with, let's say, an empirical fact, particularly about gender affirming care. This was something I was very interested in and I'm still interested in. And I would have these discussions with people about the efficacy of gender affirming care and hormones and surgery, and what the best interventions may be. And I would pull from people like Ken Zucker, but I would offer an empirical fact, cite the source and say that it came out in, say, 1990, and then the person that I was engaging with would say, oh, well, that's old, that's outdated. This person wouldn't even know the researcher that I was citing or the specific article that I was citing, and they wouldn't even be willing to go and read that article. They would just say, a priori, I don't need to pay attention to that because it's old. Now, there are so many ideas and theories that are old that have been continuously replicated or found to be more valid as time goes on. And people can still have debates about that, but I just don't think that just because an empirical fact or a theory was created at a certain time, that all of a sudden it's outdated just because it was founded way back when. I think that you have to know that theory, and then you also have to point to the newer empirical data or the newer theories that demonstrate the lack of validity of that old theory. Or you would have to demonstrate why, and this doesn't really have to deal with the time period of the empirical data, but you'd have to demonstrate why that article or empirical fact is invalid. And so if this friend had told me, oh, well, did you see this newer paper by the same author where he retracts something that he said back then? It's like, okay, that makes sense. Or even if he said, I know that paper, and I know that paper, and here's something in the method section that I don't agree with. And you can do that with really any paper, so that's not necessarily a way to invalidate it. But again, that would be, in my opinion, more productive than just simply saying, oh, this finding came out in 1990. I only look at papers that come out in 2020 or more recent. And we're going to tie that back again at the end of the video. But one last thing I wanted to just talk about. So I would talk with people and they would say, oh, that's from a pop book. That's not very useful. Oh, that empirical fact it's old. I'm sure there's more up-to-date research that probably disproves what you found. And then this last pattern or technique would be simply to just not contend with it because they aren't familiar with it. So I was having a conversation with a professor about the neuropsychology of anxiety. And at that time, I was reading the book Neuropsychology of Anxiety by Jeffrey Gray and Neil McNaughton. And I believe it's the second edition. It came out in 2004. The first edition came out in 1982. And there's a third edition that just came out last year in 2024. But anyway, I was reading the second edition, and I would try to detail out some ideas or some interpretations about specifically the hippocampus's role in anxiety, or at least one of its roles in anxiety. And I would tell this professor that, and the professor would just say, I disagree with that, I disagree with that, I disagree with that. And I would ask the professor, well, have you read this book? Are you familiar with the work of Jeffrey Gray and Neil McNaughton? And the professor would say no. And it's like, well, then how is it that you can disagree with something that you don't fully understand? And it could have been me. Maybe I wasn't presenting it in a clear fashion, or I was doing a poor job of explaining it. And I completely could take accountability for that. I would just then want the professor to say, well, actually, I have questions about this particular thing that you said. And from my knowledge, and then maybe the professor could pull from their work, or this professor is a neuropsychologist, so they could pull from their work, or they could pull from other theories and things that I hadn't thought about, and then say, oh, I understand what you're saying. Think about this theory over here. It seems that these two theories are contradicting each other, or they're at odds at some level of analysis. Maybe we could work through ways to figure out how to reconcile them, or predictions that we could make, or maybe there's some other empirical research out there to help us understand which theory would be more valid. Or maybe they're both valid, but just in different contexts. I think that those are better ways of contending with it, rather than just saying what I felt was like, I'm not familiar with that work, and I'm not going to get familiar with that work, so I don't want to talk about it. And so we have to use theories that only I'm familiar with. So for me, those are three ways to not not think critically, to cast something aside simply because it's an idea that's popular or it's in a book that sold many copies, to ignore it because it's outdated or it was published decades ago in some cases, or to just not contend with it because you're not familiar with it and you're not willing to put in the time to become familiar with it. Now, with all of that being said, I do think that people embody these patterns of engaging with ideas, in my opinion, suboptimally, because we all have to figure out how to navigate the information landscape. And this goes for the layperson dealing with social media and trying to get their news, and it also applies to the graduate student as well as the scientist. There's so much information in the world, and we have two options initially. One, we attend to all of the information in an almost serially or algorithmically characterized fashion. And as we are going through all of the information, saying what's good and what's bad and what's useful and what's not useful. But that takes too long. You can't do that. So we immediately are in this other camp where we have to filter out our information that we receive. And the way that we filter the information plays a major role in our interpretation and our conclusions. And when you're talking at those two levels of analysis, either at the level of the information or the facts itself, or the level of filtering that you do for those facts, that can lead to conflicts. Because if someone is talking about a phenomenon as if it's a brute fact, let me try that again. You and I can be reading the same article, but interpret it differently, and I could think it's valid and you could think that it's not valid. So that's one way that we can have an argument or a conflict about trying to ascertain the truth to the degree that we can figure out what's true at all. At a broader level, if you and I are discussing how emotions work in the brain, you might prefer, and this is just an example, you, for whatever reason, might enjoy computational theories of the brain. And you might think that that's great. And because of that natural preference that you have, you're going to read more books and articles and authors who share that same bias that you have. And I don't mean bias in a negative connotation. I just mean that you're going to lean towards one type of information over others. You're going to have a preference. And I might prefer theories that attempt to explain emotions in the brain from a more animal behavioristic perspective. And that's okay too. If we then come together and are trying to distinguish between what's true and what's false, well, we have different filtering mechanisms. We have different lenses. And so it's very likely that we're going to talk past each other. And I say all that to just highlight that when you're navigating this information space, when there's so much information, you have to prioritize what you're learning about. It can be helpful in having productive discussions with people by noting that distinction and asking yourself, are we having a conflict, or even are we even engaging in a conversation at the level about the raw facts themselves, or do we have some sort of difference in our filtering mechanisms that determine which information gets in and whichever information doesn't? Okay, but focusing more on the filter, this is something that I got from Steven Pinker in his book Rationality, and I believe it's called Signal Detection Theory. So imagine that you have as you're trying to sift through the information, and then let's bring it back to the academic context we're talking about. Let's take me for example, who was a graduate student and just trying to understand psychology. In every domain of knowledge, there's going to be valid and invalid knowledge, and we don't have to define those terms right now, but let's just take that as an assumption. There's two errors that you can make as you're navigating the information space. You can make a false positive or a false negative error. A false positive error is where, let's say, you read an article and you think it's true, but it's actually not true, or you think it's valid and it's actually not valid. And then a false negative would be you don't read an article because you think it's invalid, but it's actually valid. So part of the filtering that we do relates to our value judgment about those two errors. And you have to ask yourself which one you care about more. Reading an article and accepting it as true, but it's not true, so the false positive, or ignoring an article because you think it's worthless, you think it's just invaluable to you, or it doesn't have value for you, and so you ignore it, but that's actually an article that you should have read, so a false negative. And we can explore both of those judgments for a little bit. If you think that a false positive is a better error to make, so you think that a false negative is a worse error to make, well, then you're going to want to bias your reading and your research to make more of those errors. And so what you would do in that case is read a lot more papers, and you would set your criteria for determining the validity of a paper to be very low. I'm confusing myself. I think I got that right. If you think a false positive is a better error to make than a false negative, then you're going to want to make those errors more, because you're going to make errors regardless. And so if you have a preference for one error over the other, then over the long run, from your perspective, to the degree that you make more false positive errors and less false negative errors, your overall knowledge structure will be more valid, so to speak. And if you think the opposite, then you'll do the opposite. You'll want to make more false negative errors. Sorry, you're going to want to make more false negative errors than less false positive errors. And you do this by deciding what your filter is going to be. So if you want to make a lot more false positive errors, you're going to want to read a lot more information. And as you're deciding, am I going to read this article or read this book, you're going to be less stringent in that decision matrix. So some people would say, well, the most valid, what are some ways that people think that information is valid? If it comes from a trusted authority, so let's say it's published in a journal, and then some people would say, again, in the context of science and research, well, it has to also be peer reviewed. And then some people would go further. They would say, well, it has to be published in an exclusive journal like Science or Nature. And some people, I don't know, maybe I'm making stuff up at this point, but people would say, well, I need the lead author to be from an Ivy League school, or the paper itself has to have been replicated 3 times, right? And so you can stack on different criteria to increase the probability that your information that you're dealing with is valid. At the end of the day, you can't be 100% sure, which is, again, why we make those errors. But the more strict you make your filter, ideally, if you accept that those criteria and the filters actually relate to the validity of the information, well, then, again, you can increase the chance of getting valid information. If you wanted to make more false positive errors, well, then you would decrease your criterion, because you would want to take in more information, knowing that some of that information is going to be invalid, but that's okay. You're going to make those false positive informations, or those false positive errors, and ideally you're going to reduce your false negative errors. Okay, that was a lot. The point I'm trying to illustrate is that when we are navigating our information space and we're trying to understand what's true and what's valid, we filter out information. And it's not helpful to, first of all, not recognize that you filter out information. Like, that would be someone who only gets their information from Fox or only gets their information from CNN, and they take it as the gospel truth. It's like, no, there's other information out there that you're not attending to, and you made a decision consciously or unconsciously to not attend to that other information. The key takeaway that I want you guys to have from this video is that whenever you are trying to engage in a domain of knowledge, whenever you're trying to learn something about anything, you have two options. One, sift through all of the information to determine what's valid and what's not valid. Or you can utilize a decision matrix to filter out what information you're going to contend with. Now, most of us can't deal with all of the information, so we use heuristics and shortcuts to make decisions about what information we're going to deem as valid or invalid, or what information we're going to deal with prior to even engaging with it. And prior in the video, I was trying to explain these different shortcuts or heuristics that academics and some peers and professors used that I didn't think were appropriate, and that's just my opinion. Again, many of these people were full tenured professors, and many of them were PhD candidates, and I'm neither of those things, so I could be wrong. But they would use these heuristics such as, if an idea was in a popular book, I'm not going to engage with it. If an empirical fact was established decades ago, I'm not even going to deem it as credible or valid. Or they would say, I'm not familiar with that theory or those sets of ideas, so I'm not going to contend with them. And I don't think that that's the best way to wrestle with these different ideas as we're trying to figure out what's valid and what's true, and how we can generate better theories of human behavior, particularly in the realm of psychology, so that way we can better understand ourselves and better understand each other. So it's important to know that you're going to make heuristic decisions a priori about the information that you're going to contend with. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, given that you know that you have this filter, take some time to assess your filter and ask yourself if the techniques and heuristics that you're using are actually yielding you valid and credible results, and not just reaffirming your own theory that you want to be correct, even if it's not true. So thank you guys for listening to the video, and I'll see you in the next one.